from Ellen Lupton, Our Thinking with Type book. She writes, for me, discovering typography was like finding the bridge that connects art and language. Designers most commonly tap vast libraries of typefaces, choosing and combining, knowing how and why letter forms evolved helps us to communicate typographically with wit and wisdom. Words originated as gestures of body. The first typefaces were directly molded from the forms of calligraphy. Typefaces are manufactured images designed with infinite repetition. So here we're going to talk about the history of typography, and starting at the beginning for the Western alphabet of movable type was invented by Johann Gutenberg, 15th century Germany, with the first Latin alphabet that was printed. His typography was, of course, built right after the dense handwriting of the scribes that were scribing with a type treatment that was called black letter. And so the very first type blocks that were used with black letter typefaces. It's really the tension between hand and machine, this idea of organic and geometric and human body and abstract systems. So the movable type replaced scribes. We now have metal attached to wooden blocks. And this method was used, and after pages were printed, so what was happening is you had these blocks, each letter was on its own separate little block. And so all of the pages would be set up on the press, and they were locked in place. And after you're done printing, they would have to be disassembled, and they would be put away in what were called type cases. And traditional storage of fonts were in two cases. All the majuscules, which were the what we call today capital letters, were in the uppercase, and all the minuscules, which we would call now lowercase letters, were in the lowercase. So the terms uppercase and lowercase literally came from the way type was stored from movable type. The majuscules were in the uppercase and the lowers were in the lowercase. And we've used those terms today. And so that came from the printing with movable type. That's where that terminology came from. So after printing started in Germany, in Europe, and then it moved on to Venice. And working in Venice, the late 15th century, Nicholas Jensen created letters that combined Gothic calligraphic traditions with new Italian taste for humanist handwriting, which were based on classical models. So you can see this typeface looks much more closer to what we use today than, of course, the black letter that was being used in Germany. Here is an example of Adobe's version of Nicholas Jensen's typeface. And this is both the Roman and the italic version of it. Again, the italic version looks more calligraphic. And so true italic versus oblique. So when you're on your computer, and how many of you are familiar, there's a little button in most of your programs that say italic. If you click the button, the typeface turns italic. How many of us are familiar with that little button? Yeah, a few of us, right? Okay, type crime. Never use the little button that says italic, because what that's doing is that's actually programmatically obliquing your typeface. That's not what italic typeface is. And when you look at this, you notice, look at the F. It's not just a angled F from the Roman typeface. It is a completely different drawing of a letter form. So whenever you need in design now, it's fine what you do for your papers in your English class and so on and so forth. But when you're working in design, never, ever, ever use that italic button or the bold button any of the buttons. Don't use them. You go up to the type menu and you select italic and you select bold and so on and so forth. You don't choose the buttons because they are very different typefaces. So make sure you don't click the typeface. So here's an example.
Jensen's Roman typeface. Can you guys still hear me when I take these out? My earbuds just died. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, good.
Okay. So, okay, thank you. So this is an example of Jensen's Roman typeface, cut in 1470 on the bottom, and above is the Adobe version. So italic was invented. Okay, so the Venetians invented italic typeface with Adobe Jensen's, not Adobe, with Jensen's, Nicholas Jensen's typeface. And what they realized is, just like in earlier days, the need for getting more words on a page, because paper was expensive, printing was expensive. And so they were printing full books all in italic because they could get more words on a page if everything was in italic. So they were starting to do that. So here's an example of integrated uppercase and lowercase typefaces and italics. You can kind of get the full feeling of Jensen's Roman and italic types. Here's an example of Adobe Jensen used and a book cover. So here's a book cover that's using, as you can see, it's using Adobe Jensen for the title, and both the Roman version and the italic are both used on this book cover. So here we are in 3 different examples of Garamond. We have ITC Garamond from 1976, Adobe Garamond from 1986, another decade later, and then Garamond Premier Regular from 2005. They're all Garamond based on the Renaissance designs of Claude Garamond in the 16th century. However, these 3 different digitized versions of Garamond clearly look different, don't they? Or do they look the same? What do you think?
Number 1 looks different. Number 2 and 3, I could see a difference a little bit. Actually, no, I can't.
The third one looks sharper. If you look at the Z and like the A, maybe the top of the A, the curve, it looks a little bit, how do I tell you, like a little harder. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. A good way to look at it also is some of the details, like look at the finial at the bottom of the Y. Looks like a teardrop here, a little more oval, like more circular here, more oval here, and then more squared off here, right?
And the D's, the curves of the D's too.
Yeah, curves of the D's. The X height, the actual height of the letter forms is a little different as well. Taller in the first one. And of course, the stroke in that first one is much heavier than the stroke of the other 2, right? So the reason I show you these 3 variations is they're all Garamond. So if I were to say to you, the next assignment, you have to use Garamond. But let's say you all chose a different version of Garamond. They would all look quite different ultimately if we were working in them, because there are 3 very different kinds of Garamond. So whenever we're, especially these typefaces that I'm introducing you to today that are hundreds of years old, but are also quite popular, and you'll see in some examples I'm sharing you used over and over again today, you have to identify what version, what boundary of that typeface you're going to use. So if you're using Garamond, you can't just say I'm using Garamond. You have to tell me, is it Adobe Garamond? Is it Garamond Premier Regular? Or is it ITC Garamond? Because if we were to pass this design on to someone else and they needed to add to it, they would need to know what version of which version of Garamond to download so that they could work on that file, right? It can't just be Garamond, because if they downloaded ITC, and the whole piece was done in Garamond Premier, the ITC Garamond wouldn't match at all what was done in the Go, in Garamond Premier. So it's just making you aware that many typefaces might have similar names because they're based on historic typefaces, and they're all drawn by artists with a different interpretation of those designs. This is Garamond in the in the Apple campaigns used Garamond, but another interpretation of Garamond. All right, we're moving into Enlightenment and abstraction. The French designer Geoffrey Torrey believed that proportions of the alphabet should reflect the ideal human, right? He wrote the cross stroke covers the man's origin of generation, signifying modesty and chastity, right? He is looking at anatomy of the body, anatomy of letters, and kind of trying to see how can we identify what would be a well-formed letter. It kind of, these kind of humanist ideas were creating kind of quasi-scientific lines and creating meshed grids, linear sculpted qualities. It's kind of a scientific attitude of the day. So they were trying to really kind of identify what would be the best proportions and way, and how can we tie that into the human body and the human condition, if you will. Some typefaces that came out of this time was Caslon. William Caslon was a 18th century English printer, and his typeface was characterized by crisp, outright characters that recall the fluid strokes of the flexible steel pen and pointed quill. And so again, the tool is dictating the design of the typeface. You can see Caslon is a typeface that we could see. This is designed in 18th century England, and we use it today. Adobe has its own version of Caslon, and here's an example of a brand for the Kimpton hotels. The word Monaco is in Caslon, the Kimpton Hotel and the places that's in Gill Sands, but the word Monaco is in Caslon. And then we move on to John Baskerville in 1750s and 60s. He sought to surpass Caslon. His goal was to, take over and be the most popular typeface. And so what was happening as he was kind of becoming competition for Caslon, there was some basically propaganda that was put out saying, his contemporaries, Caslon and the printers that were all on Caslon's side were saying that Baskerville's typeface has this very severe thick to thin ratio, and it's blinding all of its readers of the nation. His strokes are too thin and narrow, and they are hurting people's eyes. And so I want you to see a page printed by John Baskerville. Be careful. I don't want you to hurt your eyes. Be careful. So clearly, this was just to get trying to somehow dismiss him because he was competition. Here's an example of a current book that was won many book cover awards a couple years ago, and this is done in Baskerville. Working in the media of engraving and flexible steel pens, 18th century masters such as George Bickham created lavishly curved scripts, and such alphabets influenced the designs of Baskerville, Didot, and Bodoni. And so we're moving on to French printer Didot, who took what Baskerville was doing and decided that wasn't extreme enough. And so he went and really explored wholly vertical accesses in the letter forms and a razor thin serif. So he really wanted that very extreme thick to thin. So, I mean, if Baskerville was blinding people, I don't even know, I guess, I think even just looking at this briefly would blind you if Baskerville was blinding. So, but I want you to look at what this is Didot, and then in Italy, we were going to Bedoni, so that was France. And then here's Bedoni, which is the Italian version. And here's some more examples of Bedoni. So Bedoni and Didot are very similar. They have they're modern. They're in the modern category. They have totally vertical axes, severe extreme contrast, razor thin serifs. And this is the industry that uses Didot and Bedoni. So you have fashion, so Vogue, CK, and many more. Monster fonts. Now we're moving into the 20th century, the rise of industrialization. Up until this point, typefaces were for books. I mean, everything that was printed was books. You saw everything that was a book, pages, nothing beyond books. And with the rise of industrialization, we became, our industry, graphic design, was born. Because up until this point, it was just printing. But with industrialization came the need to package things. And so up until this point, when you needed flour, sugar, eggs, milk, you went and took your own bags and containers to your local store and they filled them for you. There were no choices. You filled up a bag of flour, you filled up a bag of salt, you filled up a bag of sugar, eggs, milk, so on and so forth. There were no choices. There were no brands. Everything was bulk. You filled up and you got what you needed. Now we have industrialization, we have factories, we have cities, and we have the need, the invention of pasteurization happens, the invention of the tin can happens. We have the need to package food. Cities were getting very big. They were very dirty. There was no sanitation. There was no pasteurization. And the idea of, and food was spoiling, people were getting sick on food. And so brands came about with the ability of to package food in tin cans and choosing convenience of having choices. And so here we had to have advertising. And so once advertising was necessary to advertise these new brands and these new choices you had, we needed big fonts to go on these big posters, because now the printing has gone from the book to now big posters and big billboards and the sides of trucks and into signage and so on and so forth. So now fonts are being designed for advertising. So you get fat faces that are inflated like hyperbold Bedoni on steroids. Big, tall fonts so that they can fit in small, narrow spaces and you can see them from far away when you're riding in your carriage. Egyptian or slab serifs are introduced around 1806, transforming the serif from a refined detail to a load-bearing slab to really help you see them and make a big impact. Serifs are no longer utilitarian, they are now decorative. They are now, think of like circus posters and circus fonts. They become part of the story. They add decoration, they add interest. Here's an advertisement from 1875. Notice how many different typefaces are on this poster. So many. It's all symmetrical, but it's richly varied and it's very static, very conventional layout. So this Dada poster basically is kind of going against the grain of what this advertising was doing. This is a rejection against monster fonts. This is trying to do their own thing. There's nothing centered, nothing conventional about this. And every letter of the word is changing typefaces, not the words themselves. So this is kind of almost becomes an art piece. And this is done in 1923. We move to Reform and Revolution. And this is really that kind of moving away from the monster font. So now we go into Edward Johnson, who created this chart of essential characters of Roman inscription, 1906. Part of his quest was to revive the search for an essential standard alphabet. And he was reacting against those monster fonts of the 19th century of commercial advertising. He was, William Morris was also a reformer, and he was starting to recapture the dark and solemn density of Nicholas Jensen's pages. Remember Nicholas Jensen? And he wanted to get away from the ugliness of the 19th century commercial printing. So here's compare William Morris's golden to its Renaissance source, the typefaces of Nicholas Jensen. And then here's that Adobe Jensen. So now that's happening in the 1920s. And at the same time, we're also getting the Dutch avant-garde journal De Stil designing this logo at the top here for 1917. The letters consist of pixel-like blocks. Don't they look like they could be for a modern video game? They feel very digital, yet, you know, this was done in 1917. And then below it, Theo van Doesburg, founder of the De Stil movement, created this alphabet using only perpendicular elements in 1919. No, no angles. And again, I feel like this feels very modern and digital. So now we're looking at the Bauhaus, 1925, same time, the 20s. So we have, the William Morris, we have the De Stil movement, and now we have the Bauhaus. And I want you to look closely at this alphabet. Is there a logo that any of these letters remind you of in this alphabet?
IHOP?
Oh, maybe. The
I was
new
gonna say
logo.
the ABC logo. You know, like
Similar, but there's actually a different font they use, but similar.
Beats.
Who said it?
Nathan. Beats.
That's right. Beats by Dr. Dre. They just took the B from Herbert Baer's Universal from the Bauhaus. So not so original, but it's good to know, where it's coming from. Here's another same era, 1920s, Futura. This is in Germany. This font is used widely today. Can anyone tell me what brands this font might remind you of? It's another geometric, meaning that has perfect circles. They're not ovals.
Maybe like Bed Bath and Beyond.
I don't know their logo very well. I have to look it up. But that isn't the one I'm thinking of. This one, I'm going to give you a hint. It's a very popular streetwear brand.
Supreme?
Oops. Yes, Supreme. It's Futura in a red block. Another interesting thing that was happening, now we're moving into the 60s. So in the 60s, what was happening is, we're in the space race. We're getting those big rooms full of computers, right? The computers were taking up a whole room. So designers were thinking that there needed to be a new alphabet with no diagonals or no curves, because everything was going to be bitmapped. They were looking at the bitmap. And so this was invented. Of course, can any of you read that? So this top headline reads New Alphabet. So the backwards L is an A. So it never came to this, but they were prepared if that was necessary. Because as we were moving in time, so that was in the 60s, now here we are in the 80s, and Susanna Lico from Emigre was looking at creating low-res typefaces, because here we are trying to figure out how to embrace the language of digital equipment, dot matrix printers. And so these new primitives were developed to try to help designers work with the technology that we were dealing with at that era. Here's some more examples coming out of France. Contemporary variations of reduced geometric typefaces. That did not last very long, thankfully. We enter into the 90s. And so we're in the time now of grunge, and we now thankfully have anti-aliasing, we have laser printers, and so we can go back to getting away from that bit mapping and go back to designing typefaces. But this is really speaking to the era of wanting to be something that wasn't perfect, something that was really a morphing of typefaces. So much like our morph versions we were looking at. Here's another one. Here's an example of P. Scott Michaela taking a serif typeface and a rounded sans serif typeface and literally smashing them together and creating this mishmash of a half serif, half sans serif typeface. So that was happening in the early 90s. I lived through it. I was working in industry at the time, and I have guilty of using both of those typefaces in work back in the 90s. But this one is actually one of my favorite typefaces that came out of the 90s. And this was also designed by Susanna Lico, and it's called Mrs. Eves. And it's named after John Baskerville's housekeeper, Sarah Eves, who was also his mistress and his creative assistant. And actually, we think she did a lot more than she's ever gotten credit for working in his studio. And so Susanna named the typeface after her. And it has, it's based on Baskerville. It has a Roman, an italic, a small cap, and then also ligatures. And ligatures, does anyone know what that term means? You guys familiar with ligatures?
Is it when the letters like kind of combine into each other?
Yeah, exactly. It's when two letters combine into each other. So most common one is like an F coming into a I, the dot of the I. So yeah, exactly. Here's an example of the two, Roman and italic. Here is Fred Smeal's Quadrat, offering a crisp interpretation of 16th century designs. And the thing that's unique about Quadrat is that you have your Roman all cap, and then here's the italic version, but the italic version is angular. So, you know, it's not quite as calligraphic. It has a real distinct, almost angular, sharp-edged side to it, unlike the Roman version. So the next typeface is going to take us into the 2000s. Tobias Freer Jones designed Gotham in 2000. And they were influenced by the Port Authority bus terminal in New York. And this became the typography's first family, because the Obama 2008 campaign chose Gotham to be their typeface of choice. And as a result, this became the most popular typeface of the 2000s. And they were by 2009, there were over 50 weights and styles of Gotham that were commissioned because it became the typeface for the campaign. And I think to this day, through the 2000s, this is probably like the new Helvetica, if you will. This has like replaced Helvetica. And lastly, I'm going to say we have to think about type in transportation, because, you know, we in the US have a highway system that has been using what we called what was called Highway Gothic for decades. We are now living through a time in history where we have more elderly people in our country than we ever have in the history of the United States, because the baby boom population is now all over 60. And so about 20 years ago, a campaign was started to say, we are going to have this large elderly population, and we can do better with our street signs. We can make them much more legible and easy and user-friendly and more accessible to anyone with vision issues. And so a new typeface was designed called Clearview Highway. And so you can see the top example is Clearview, the bottom is Highway Gothic, which is currently used. Excuse me, Highway Gothic, you can see the letter forms A and E's are kind of filling in, and the cascade A's, the A's and E's in Clearview have a much higher X height and are much more open, and so much more visible.